Alright, just got done playing a little basketball with my son. The topic for this video is legal versus lawful. Legal can be, legal is a root word for legislation. Call it legality, legislation, legal, all the same thing, okay? So legalities, legislation, is it's not absolute, it's relative. The way legislation comes about is you have politicians. They have opinions. They write their opinions on fancy pieces of paper, and they vote on it and they pass it, and they call this legislation. It can change. New politicians can get voted in. They could have different opinions. Typically, they just add and add and add and add to this legislation. If you took all the legislation in all the world and you put it all together, it would take up many football stadiums. You've heard the saying, ignorance of the law is no excuse, right? A lot of times people are like, you have to obey the law, or it's a sin not to obey the law, which is true, and it's true, ignorance of the law is no excuse. But when you hear that, don't immediately think of legislation. The law is very simple. Jesus made it very simple for us, okay? The law is this: love God and love your neighbor. If you do these two things, you will not be breaking any laws. You might be doing some illegal activities. You might be breaking legislation, but you will not be breaking the law. Love God, love your neighbor. That's the law. That's written on your heart. It's coded in your DNA. You have a conscience with knowledge. Legislation, on the other hand, it's impossible to know all the legislation in the world. It is a good excuse to be ignorant of legislation. Just trying to regain a thought here. The other day I gave a lesson on the difference between education and wisdom. Education, I said, is a moving target. It's relative to who's teaching it and what's being taught. Wisdom is absolute, and it comes from God. The same thing with legal and lawful. Legalities, legislation, these are variable. They're like a moving target. It's relative to who's in office, who's the politician writing and passing the legislation, what's in the legislation. Law is absolute, and it comes from God. 100% it comes from God. You can be doing something illegal and it not be lawful, and vice versa. You can be doing something completely legal and it be completely unlawful. For instance, abortion. Abortion is legal, but it's 100% unlawful. And it's important Christians understand the difference between legal and lawful. All right? We don't have to go out there and obey legislation that says it's okay to murder children, or obey legislation that says you have to back down in your church and let there be homosexual weddings there, or you have to back down and let homosexuals stay in your bed and breakfast, or you have to back down and you have to decorate a wedding cake for sodomites. You don't have to obey legislation. What you have to obey is God's law. And that's the important thing to understand here. That's the point I want to try to get across here. I always say this is my personal rule. When in Rome, do as the Romans. I'll obey the legislation until it gets in the way of my faith, my freedom, or my safety. If I see a speed limit sign that says 35 miles an hour, but there's a car, coming at me in a perpendicular direction, and I have to floor it and speed to get past, the point where that car is going to slam into me, I'm going to worry about my safety first. I'm not going to worry about breaking some code or some legislation that some politician wrote up. Okay, I have an obligation to myself and my family first and foremost. I hope everybody understands this. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comment box, and we can discuss it.